I have so many ideas, I almost don't know where to begin with all of them. So I'm just going to start kind of broadly and then hopefully narrow down a little bit. So the last story that I was talking about was a little bit of uh, Adam and Eve, the creation story, a little bit of Ibrahim, and a little bit of um, David. And when I talked about the idols and Ibrahim, I almost want to relate it back to the Hindu scriptures and then kind of give kind of like a bit of a modernized twist on maybe what I understand of the icons that they have currently that you might find in present day. I studied a little bit of the Hindu philosophy. I had not very much of it to be able to kind of speak with it or about it in any kind of scholarly way. But just to say that from what I understood when I did study is that they don't actually worship the icon itself as a god, the way maybe I talked about the way maybe Ibrahim understood his community used to preserve icons for. So the way they would kind of keep the icon was almost to say, um, if I am praying for education or for knowledge, I would almost go into a prayer hall or like a chamber, and I would almost have this image, and it would maybe help me um, envision or find the words to remind me of all the things that bring knowledge, right? So it's not unlike the invocations that we have with Muhammad that he kind of came with. You'll have a lot of booklets and pamphlets that'll sometimes have really, really concise ideas that we can kind of think with. So it's kind of the same thing. Like you can, because basically language is a symbol. Icons are a symbol. Arts are a different kind of symbol. It's basically just ways of containing meaning to help almost encourage us to think of certain things. So if we don't get caught up in the actual icon itself being a god or language being a god, like a book being a god or a person being a god, but instead they're just almost bridges to help us almost come closer to an understanding of the universe, then I think we'll be safe from understanding why polytheism or idolatry is a problem. We'll be safe in understanding why it is a problem, and at the same time, safe from being quick to judge other people who maybe look like they're like involved in idol worship, but really, it's just a way of bringing about a spiritual understanding within them that helps keep their mind focused, so that their mind doesn't, you know, get distracted very easily. I say this because for me, learning to pray and not rush through prayer was something that was a very long sort of practice that I had to practice for a very, very long time. So sometimes, depending on um, the surroundings that I'm in, like if I'm at work and I'm just taking some time off to pray, sometimes I'm thinking about, oh, I only have 15 minutes, so I have to hurry up. Or I'm thinking I'm in a small space and somebody might come in, so I have to hurry up. Sometimes it's in a, in an actual mosque, which is like just a dedicated place for worship, and you think, well, I can just take my time and it doesn't really matter. So knowing all of this almost is it's a relief in a way because it allows people who aren't really familiar with these different practices within traditions or within religion um, to almost find a way to relate to them and to be a little bit understanding and just not feel like if I ask you, are you going to be offended? People used to sometimes say that to me, like, I don't mean to offend you, but is it okay if I ask? And for me, it was always like, yeah, of course. And now that I think back, I think maybe they feel like, am I going to offend you because you're doing a practice that you don't really have an explanation for? In which case, it might feel like I might feel defensive, like it's just a tradition that I kind of like when I talked about Easter. So for some people, that might just be like that's a good question. Like, you know what? I do this because it brings me peace, but maybe I should go find the origin story and figure out why this is something that I enjoy doing. So with that, I'm going to kind of segue into why I started talking about the creation stories from an emotional perspective. I linked one of the videos in the past with an archived PDF file that talks about the different diseases of the heart. And it's also almost augmented with how to cure these emotions or these kind of ill will that we can kind of harbor in our heart without really knowing that we are and why. So it can be kind of a difficult read because it kind of makes you kind of look at yourself and think like, oh my gosh, I embody all of these. Like how do I begin with myself? But knowing that is almost like a safe understanding because then I understand why people want a spiritual path and why they take time off and try to understand like I have to give religion a completely different look that's completely stripped from the stereotypes that we're so accustomed to kind of attributing to a way of life. So I remember I had taken actually some time off. I think it was like a month and a half, where I traveled to Egypt with my dad, and I didn't really have much to do. We didn't have a computer. There was like an internet cafe that was just around the corner, but I had brought that book with me, and I just spent a lot of the time when we weren't visiting family to just sit and read it and just kind of wonder about all the different meanings. And it's really enlightening because it tells you, it kind of gives you like an explanation of what something is, and then uh, it'll tell you why we can sort of end up having this emotion, and then how to overcome it. So if we think so far, we've talked about pride, we've talked about desire, we talked about the ego, and then with the story about Cain and Abel, a little bit of impatience, kind of something around I don't really understand what it means to have God accept something of me, and then like we don't know anything about long term goals and how sometimes the universe has to align in a certain way for a prayer to come into fruition. So all these things we almost learn from um, previous people almost experimenting with life, and then we learning the stories and then trying in a new different way, that's maybe kind of built on what their errors were, but we're trying to improve on it. So it's not to say that they did it wrong. It's almost like we're grateful that you did it wrong so that we can learn how to improve on it. And that kind of goes back to the idea of it doesn't mean that they're bad or we should kind of label them as bad or just keep them fixed in like a bad box, as it were, and then just like um, have that association in our mind about them. But it's almost to say, I'm glad that you were patient enough to allow God to use you in this very trying and very difficult way, and um, think of the beneficial knowledge this actually enables in the future, right? So we can think of Einstein, like, right? He created information that taught us about nuclear energy and it created bombs, but the long-term effect of that is people will benefit and hopefully overcome with positive, uh, I guess, innovations, whatever negative might have sort of been at the beginning. So there's a little bit of negative, but hopefully the long run there'll be so much positive that'll overcome and maybe kind of diminish a little bit of what the negative was. So one of the, I guess, stories we can think of as kind of like a primitive society was Adam and Eve, kind of just new to the earth, and they're working right now with agriculture and livestock. So you might think it was kind of appropriate that Cain, who was working with livestock, seemed to be the one that was impatient. Because if you think of planting, especially if you're thinking something that we're going to eat very soon, you think, okay, I planted in one season and maybe in a few weeks, maybe months, I have something to eat, right? So that is almost like I can almost foresee when the reward for my efforts will be. And from that, it's almost like, oh, that wasn't so bad. It was kind of easy. Somebody who is raising livestock, that takes so much energy. Like if you see the amount of work that goes into um, people who live. I used to read novels when I was young, and sometimes around ranch life, and the way the authors would talk about how ranchers would live and the amount, like they'd wake up from sunup and their hard work all the time with the animals until the end of the day, you kind of get an appreciation for the amount of work and effort that they have to put in, and why they have a very hardy lifestyle in spite of the fact that it's harsh. Though they're very kind people because they almost have a way of understanding how to deal with nature in a kind way. So with that in mind, you can think of somebody who's dealing with livestock, right? You can't take a shortcut with how a baby cow is going to develop like a calf, right? It needs a certain amount of years before it can develop, and then you decide, okay, I think it's ready for me to sacrifice it if it's going to be for, a greater purpose, that maybe to feed the poor. At the time, it would have been, well, we just want to see what a sacrifice to God is and what it would look like, and how do we know if it's accepted or not. So it's almost like God's almost helping us understand. Like it's not like sometimes people say that when they talk about Jesus that God sacrificed His Son. If I borrow that idea and kind of build on it, it's almost like God's allowing humanity to make mistakes with the knowledge that He can forgive them and He wants to forgive them. But it's almost to say, don't wonder like why did Cain have to, end up having to worry about murder, and why was his kind of sacrifice to God already not accepted? Maybe it's God's kind way and charitable way of saying, in the future, when you do look back, you can understand that, yeah, what was the consequence of taking somebody's life before maybe it was time? And it could be, well, it caused a lot of sadness in the world. It caused Abel to be almost behind in understanding how to live in the world because we don't know when he's going to wake up again. Eve, his mother, now has to worry about, like, I just lost my child. A sister has to worry about, I lost my brother, or a wife has to worry about how do I deal with the loss of my husband. So all of these things are almost, if you think of like a mind map, they almost open up different ideas in your mind where you start to think, well, what emotions kind of come out of all of this? And then you can come back to Muhammad and say, okay, so the first 10 years we're talking about oneness, which is how to be charitable with nature and ourselves and what earnings we have so that we can keep our earnings healthy and they don't corrupt itself. Usually we can associate that with hoarding. So then you think, okay, now the next 13 years is talking about how to deal with our emotions around other people. So then you think, okay, so I have to worry about loss. Patience is that sometimes I have to contribute something and I don't know if it's going to be accepted. Sometimes people wonder, should the person who's giving the charity be the one that's thanked or the person receiving? And one idea was that sometimes, if you can probably experiment this with yourself, is that sometimes when somebody offers you something and you say no thank you, sometimes they feel sad. So sometimes it's almost like it can be a charitable act on your behalf to accept it from them, as though to say, thank you, that was really kind. And you can almost understand how it's not to bring God down below humanity, but it's almost to say that that tends to be God in the world. It's always with the compassion, always trying to almost be the one who's full of mercy and full of kindness. And then, failing that, if people are almost becoming too hungry for power in a way, then God creates almost a lot of gentle people around them to almost like, we're trying to bring you down closer to what an understanding of that reverence is so that we can all sort of find a way to maintain an understanding of God as like gentle and compassionate, while also understanding that we need that strength, because without strength, like how would we have understood how to build all these like really big constructions in the world and like these high towers and all the civilization that helps us understand how to be safe in like harsh conditions. So now, if you think of long-term investment and short-term investment, sometimes it's hard to understand what that is. So if I'm a parent and I think I have a business and I don't know that my child is going to want this business when they grow up, right? So you can think, I'm getting kind of old. I don't want to just keep this business in my family and keep it from somebody else who's interested in it, because by the time my child grows up, they might find something else that they want to do. And if I decide to keep it and then they don't want it, then they might feel like I'm forcing them to, and then it just becomes a little bit of discontent somewhere. So in this case, because you're thinking of humanity as a whole rather than just being worried about your own family, you can say, why don't I just be charitable to the universe? So they can say, I have a shoe store, for example, and somebody's coming to me and saying, we're really interested in buying your shoe store. Will you sell it to us? You can think, oh, I really want it to be, the family business. I want it for my son, or I want it for my daughter to take over after, I grow old. But then you almost have to think and assume that they would want to do that, and you don't know. So it's almost being charitable to them and suggesting, well, you know what? Their wealth in their lifespan is going to be for them regardless. And it's probably better that I give them a fair chance to try and discover what it is and explore, rather than me almost already narrowing what their options are in the world. So because of that charitable intention, that charitable kindness to the universe, that almost increases their good karma and yours. So imagine what that puts out in the world. And that is what we can understand about Abel, is that he was thinking in the long term, because even though maybe he and Cain got in an argument about, why do you get this or why do you get that, or why did God accept this from you and not me? It's almost like I don't know, like how should I know? I'm just trying to follow what we were asked to do, and this is kind of how things turned out. So in this case, you can almost see why sometimes people just have that temperament where they're almost happy to wait and kind of just see how things unfold, where other people, they just want immediate results and like, just tell me now. We all feel this, like when we write an exam, we can't wait to get the results back. Like, when's the test going to get back? When is it going to be marked? I want to find out. And then you're always like checking if something on the internet. We always want that feedback to know that we're doing okay so that we can continue moving on. And so practicing from a young age these rituals and maybe saying, I'm not going to fast for the whole day, but maybe what I'm going to do is, instead of not eating and not drinking because I need that, my body's growing, maybe I'm going to practice not playing a video game for 2 hours. So maybe every day I play for 5 hours, I'm just going to play for 3 hours. And then I'm going to spend 2 hours and I'm going to go play outside. So that's a way of delaying gratification, something you really, really like doing, but you're going to say, I'm going to trim a little bit of it and I'm going to try something new and see what happens. And in doing that, you're training your body not to always want something and have it right away. And in doing that, you're learning how to be patient. People are going to want to be your friend because you're taking your time with everything. And it also helps you understand a little bit more about your emotions. And the more you understand about your emotions, the more you build it's called emotional intelligence, where it's just you understand how to label your emotion and then how to work with it. So if you feel like, oh, I'm really angry right now and I can't figure out why, that's enough. You can just sit there and just be like, this is kind of weird. And then you can think, well, sometimes if a person's hungry, it means they don't have enough sugar that's going to their brain to help them think. So they're just impatient with themselves. So you can think, maybe I'll go have a snack. And then you might think, oh, it's maybe because, I was told that I could go outside and play, but now it's raining, so I have to think of something else to do. So understanding what these emotions are almost help us understand how to go back to what's the best way for me as a person to learn how to be innovative, which means how to become calm enough to know how to be creative. So we thought in the past, or the last video, I was talking about how the fire, for example, even though we know it burns, God said, I'm going to almost suspend the elements that makes something burn in the fire and keep it cool. So somebody could read that and say, like in the present day, and say, so it is possible for this miracle that happened in the past to enlighten us in some way in the present. It's almost like saying God is allowing something in the world to not burn with the fire. Let's figure out what that is. And maybe they'll decide to go into chemistry just to figure out, well, there has to be something. So then they'll find, oh, look, here's a material that doesn't burn in the fire. And then they decide, maybe we'll create a firefighter suit with this. So then you can think back to, okay, well, I want to think about another miracle that happened in the past. You can think about, there's a narration that Muhammad saw the moon almost split in half. We don't know how that happened, but when you think about it, you can think, okay, if I think about identical twins, I understand that it's basically two babies that look almost exactly the same. When you grow up and kind of study biology, you'll understand that maybe that's what happened to the mummy's stomach. It's that instead of one baby forming, something happened in the cells where you have two babies that look exactly the same. And you're thinking, wow, that's really cool. I wonder where else in the universe there's a parallel. And then you study the solar system and you find, oh my gosh, on Mars, it has two moons. It's a one planet. And then you think, well, I wonder what's on Mars that's different than Earth. Why does it have two moons and what does it have? So all of these things, like I was just on Facebook or Instagram, and one woman, she had a website, or her interest was around astrology or astronomy. And some people are kind of hesitant around how to understand constellations and how to look into the skies and see what to make of the different stars. And it doesn't have to be anything that fortune tells or something that tells the future. Sometimes it's just a great way to understand the stories that we can get there. Because sometimes if you look at constellations, they'll have a certain kind of look, or like an art form. So if it looks like a bear, you can think, well, I wonder what happens with bears in certain seasons. Or, it'll just create so much room for new ideas and for creativity. And then you can come back to Earth and say, well, I live in a place where there's no bears, but maybe if I go up north to Canada, I'll find something out about polar bears, and then you find, well, what is it about polar bears that I like? And then you might think about Coca-Cola and be like, oh, that's really funny. I wonder why they have that pioneering idea, like polar bears and Coca-Cola, something that's refreshing. And it might not have to have any association, but it's just a way of getting your mind used to thinking of creative ideas. And that might lead you to a story that's mythical. And then you think, yeah, I don't think that would have happened. But then you think, well, let's find out how it can happen. And then you might arrive at a story that's kind of like the dragons and the knights, and then you build your own mythology. So that's kind of what I want to do moving forward. I'm going to wonder about how the idea of farmers and how we sometimes have scarecrows in the fields, and the idea of having, it's not quite a ghost, right? But it's almost like you have something that doesn't move and it's meant to scare crows away. So if you think about crows being, they're known to be very, very intelligent creatures. So you think, okay, here's me as a human, and I'm thinking, I know that God has a limit for me with my brain. So before I can try something new, like eating from that tree, for example, there's an idea, there's an impulse, and I don't know if I'm going to be stepping outside of what my limit is right now for what I know or not. So it's almost like I'm going towards something, and then there's a scarecrow, so something's almost scaring me, and it might be something that I'm scaring myself with as a ghost. It's not really there, but maybe if it's a red flag, like I get that nervous feeling in my stomach of like butterflies, I could just pause and be like, I'm gonna write this down. And then I have to slow down and say, okay, well, what could it be that my brain wants to do, but my heart is slowing me down, and my stomach is also feeling like maybe we just have to learn a little bit more. So now that you're understanding all the different signs that your body's talking to you with, you can try to understand what the emotions are. So if you have butterflies in your stomach, that's known as anxiety, which means I need to stop because I feel like I don't want to. If your heart is beating really fast, that means I'm excited, like there's adrenaline and I want to. But if my heart's saying, or my mind is saying, no, we don't know enough information, then all that aligns. And you can just go ahead and say, okay, so maybe what I have to do then is I'm going to write all these ideas down, and then I'm going to find out what I have to do next. Maybe I have to go talk to somebody. Maybe I have to go search on Google. Maybe I have to find a video game that's related to it. And that's actually something that someone was trying to understand how to do. Is sometimes with diversity and trying to understand different cultures, we almost try to find a common ground between all of them and see how each culture will approach the same question, and then see what new ideas will kind of come up and what ones maybe we want to fade away because they don't really help us understand what we thought we could understand with them. So one of them was original sin, which I don't really know how to answer because it's almost like, well, would Cain be original sin, or would Eve be original sin, or is Adam original sin? Then you think, well, is God original sin? Like he created Adam. So all these questions kind of become like, original sin means like there was a mistake somewhere in the world. And then you think, okay, but God's forgiving, so it's not a mistake that can't be fixed. We just have to figure out what it is that we have to learn how to do. And maybe it is patience. Maybe it is, I want something really, really bad, but I just have to wait. And then I have to wonder, why do I really want it bad? Is it something because I want to, be proud of myself? Which is a healthy emotion because then it's like a positive self-esteem. But if it's to show off and make other people feel bad about themselves, then maybe that's not a healthy idea of what pride is. So I'm going to leave that one there, and then hopefully as we go, we'll understand what new miracles can kind of create innovation in the world.